right, hello. Welcome back to more content. Welcome back to the channel. Welcome back to more deep diving into these bills. Okay, guys. So yesterday I put up a update on what to expect from my channel and all of that fun stuff. And with that being said, this is the bill that I mentioned. All right. HR 6644, Housing for the 21st Century Act. Whew, this is a hefty bill. So this was not what I initially meant to go into or planned to go into next. I was going to do more on like children's privacy and more children adjacent legislation that affected, kids. Just to go with the subject matter that I was already talking about, right? But then I saw this and I was like, first of all, Housing for the 21st Century Act. My mind, what a name. What do you do? So this is also already passed the House, all right? But not the Senate. So I felt like if we were going to get into this, which it's going to be multiple parts because this is a big bill. HR 6644, the goal of this bill, by the way, is to increase the supply of housing in America and for other purposes. I'm so cynical now. I'm like, what other purposes? What are these? All right. In the Senate of the United States, February 11th, 2026 received. February 23rd, 2026 read the first time. February 24th, 2026 read the second time and placed on the calendar. Yeah, that was like what, like a little over a week ago? See how fast they move once they introduce these bills? It's kind of crazy. Okay. And it's not good whenever it's stuff that shouldn't be put across, by the way, that harms the American people. Just throwing that out there. An act to increase the supply of housing in America and for other purposes, be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America in Congress assembled. Section 1, short title, table of contents. A, short title. This act may be cited as a Housing for the 21st Century Act. 2, table of contents. The table of contents for this act is as follows. Okay, guys, so what we're going to do here, we're going to do this a little differently. Usually I read the whole table of contents and then we'll get into the bill. This is insane. This is insanely long. And we're not doing all this in one video. So I'm going to go ahead and break them up. Most likely, I'm going to try keeping them broken up by titles. So we're going to start with Title 1. And then we'll go down, read it, and then we'll come back and so on and so on, okay? Title 1. Building Smarter for the 21st Century. Okay, so this has 7 sections, okay? Section 101. Housing Supply Frameworks. Section 102, Accelerating Home Building Grant Program. Section 103, Federal Guidelines for Point Access Block Buildings. Section 104, Unlocking Housing Supply Through Streamlined and Modernized Reviews. Section 105, Federal Housing Agency Application of Environmental Reviews. Section 106, Multifamily Loan Limits. Section 107, GAO Study on Workforce Housing. Guys, keep in mind that, just like a little context here, this stuff they're talking about, and we'll get into it, heavily impacts your housing initiatives, your what the programs for affordable housing in your city. Okay, this is going to impact all of that. This is like really important to, especially if affordable housing affects you. All right, here we go. Title 1, Building Smarter for the 21st Century. Section 101, Housing Supply Frameworks. All right, we're going to get into the definitions of this. 1, affordable housing. The term affordable housing means housing for which the monthly payment is not more than 30% of the monthly income of the household. And if you've never dealt with affordable housing, this gives you a little bit more context into the demographic and, the way it's affordable. And of course, there are many, many limits on this in terms of how much people can even be making to qualify for someone who could go for affordable housing. But if you're already making a extraordinarily low income, this is to keep your housing payments from eating all of that income. 2, Assistant Secretary. The term Assistant Secretary means the Assistant Secretary for Policy Development and Research of the Department of Housing and Urban Development. All right, guys, right here. And I know I'm not going to stop after every definition, but this one's important. Department of Housing and Urban Development. That comes up a lot in city politics and city legislation, especially in housing. So I'm going to refer to it as throughout the rest of this bill as HUD. So Department of Housing and Urban Development is also referred to as HUD, H-U-D. Because you're going to see that, like when you hear HUD, That is what they're referring to. And more often than not, I've seen them refer to it as HUD and not the Department of Housing and Urban Development. So just for your for context and for your knowledge, that's what they mean. When they talk about HUD, they're talking about the Department of Housing and Urban Development, okay? And it's more often commonly referred to as HUD. All right, 3, local zoning framework. The term local zoning framework means the local zoning codes and other ordinances, procedures, and policies governing zoning and land use at the local level. Secretary. The term secretary means the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, so the Secretary of HUD. State zoning framework. The term state zoning framework means the state legislation or state agency and department procedures or such legislation or procedures in an insular area of the U.S., enabling local planning and zoning authorities and establishing and guiding related policies and programs. Guidelines on state and local zoning frameworks. In general, not later than 3 years after the date of enactment of this act, the Assistant Secretary shall publish documents outlining guidelines and best practices to support production of adequate housing to meet the needs of communities and provide housing opportunities for individuals at every income level across communities with respect to A, state zoning frameworks, and B, local zoning frameworks. Consultation. Public comment. During the 2-year period beginning on the date of enactment of this act, in developing the guidelines and best practices required under paragraph 1, the Assistant Secretary shall A, publish draft guidelines and best practices in the Federal Register for public comment, and B, establish a task force for the purpose of providing consultation to draft the guidelines and best practices published under subparagraph A, the members of which shall include urban planners and architects, housing developers including affordable and market rate housing developers, manufactured housing developers, cooperative housing developers, and other business interests, community engagement experts and community members impacted by zoning decisions, public housing agencies and transit authorities, members of local zoning and planning boards and local and regional transportation planning organizations, state officials responsible for housing or land use, including members of state zoning boards of appeals, academic researchers, and home builders. Okay, so you have a nice mixed bag of people that are in different aspects of housing. I do like academic research to be included in here. That's actually really interesting. I like to see who they decide to pick in that, if they did push this through. Contents. The guidelines and best practices required under paragraph 1 shall A, with respect to state zoning frameworks, outline potential models for updated state enabling legislation or state agency and department procedures. Include recommendations regarding 1, the reduction or elimination of parking minimums, 2, the increase in maximum floor area ratio requirements and maximum building heights, and the reduction in minimum lot sizes and setback requirements. 3, the elimination of restrictions against accessory dwelling units. 4, increasing by right uses, including duplex, triplex, or quadplex buildings across cities or metropolitan areas. 5, mechanisms including proximity to transit to determine the appropriate scope for rezoning and ensure development that does not disproportionately burden residents of economically distressed areas. Okay. 6, provisions regarding review of by right development proposals to streamline review and reduce uncertainty, including 1, non-discretionary ministerial review, and 2, entitlement and design review processes. 7, the reduction of obstacles, regulatory or otherwise, to a range of housing types at all levels of affordability, including manufactured and modular housing. Okay, so I was going to say, those obstacles take a lot of forms, don't they? In terms of some of those obstacles being because they're not correctly regulated or they're not meeting regulation guidelines. So what, are you telling me you're trying to get past this bill to bypass that? Because wouldn't that be a safety hazard? Unless they mean this in another way. State model zoning regulations for directing local reforms, including mechanisms to encourage adoption. 9, provisions to encourage transit-oriented development, including increased permissible units per structure and reduced minimum lot sizes near existed or planned public transit stations. 10, potential reforms to strengthen the public engagement process. 11, reforms to protest petition statutes. 12, the standardization, reduction, or elimination of impact fees. 13, cost-effective and appropriate building codes. 14, models for community benefit agreements. 15, Mechanisms to preserve affordability, limit disruption of low-income communities, and prevent displacement of existing residences. 19. With respect to state zoning frameworks, 1. State model codes for directing local reforms, including mechanisms to encourage adoption. 2. A model for a state zoning appeals process, which would create a process for developers or builders requesting a variance, conditional use, special permit, zoning district change, similar discretionary permit, or otherwise petitioning a local zoning or planning board for a project including a state-defined amount of affordable housing to appeal a rejection to a state body or regional body empowered by the state, and establish qualifications for communities to be exempted from the appeals process based on their available stock of affordable housing. 3. Streamlining of state environmental review policies. Okay, and then we have 17. With respect to local zoning frameworks, the simplification and standardization of existing zoning codes. Maximum review timelines. Streamlining of state environmental review policies. 17. With respect to local zoning frameworks, the simplification and standardization of existing zoning codes. Maximum review timelines. Best practices for the disposition of land owned by local governments for affordable housing development. Differentiations between best practices for rural, suburban, and urban communities and communities with different levels of density or population distribution. Streamlining of local environmental review policies. And 18. Other land use measures that promote access to new housing opportunities identified by the Secretary, and consider the effects of adopting any recommendation on eligibility for federal discretionary grants and tax credits for the purpose of housing or community development. Coordination between infrastructure, investments, and housing planning. Local housing needs, including ways to set and measure housing goals and targets. A range of affordability for rental units with a prioritization of units attainable to extremely low, and moderate income residents. A range of affordability for homeownership. Accountability measures. The long cost to residents and businesses of more housing is not constructed. Barriers to individuals seeking to access affordable housing in growing communities and communities with economic opportunity. With respect to state zoning frameworks, 1. Distinction between states providing constitutional or statutory home rule authority to municipalities and states operating under the Dillon Rule, as articulated in Hunter v. Pittsburgh, 207 U.S. 161, 1907. So, 207 U.S. 161, 1907, otherwise known as the Dillon Rule. Just a reminder, the Dillon Rule basically establishes that municipalities are mere creatures of the state with no inherent powers. The court ruled that states have absolute control over local governments, which derive all powers solely from state legislation, allowing states to create, modify, or destroy them. So local governments have some power, but their power is provided under the state. So if the state ever decided, oh, I don't like what you're doing, the state would be able to modify that as they pleased or restrict that as they pleased, right? Some key aspects of the Dillon Rule: absolute state sovereignty. Local governments are political subdivisions of the state created as convenient agencies to exercise delegated powers, not their own powers, but it's just to help the state streamline their own power. And then, of course, because of that, they have limited power, the local governments. Strict construction. Any fair or reasonable doubt concerning the existence of a power is resolved by the courts against the local cooperation, meaning the power is denied, so the courts would side with the states. No federal protection. Hunter established that local governments cannot invoke the 14th Amendment against their own state, as they possess no rights or powers independent of the state legislator. So those are just some key reminders. All right. Okay. Statewide mechanisms to preserve existing affordability over the long term, including support for land banks and community land trust. And then public comments elicited under paragraph 2A and other considerations as identified by the Assistant Secretary. C. Abolishment of the Regulatory Barriers Clearinghouse. 1. In general, the Regulatory Barriers Clearinghouse established pursuant to Section 1205 of the Housing and Community Development Act of 1992, 42 U.S.C. 12705D, is abolished. What is that? We always want to look at the things they want to abolish. Okay, the 42 U.S.C. Code 12705D contains the following. A. Establishment. The Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, the Secretary of HUD, shall establish a clearinghouse to serve as a national repository to receive, collect, process, assemble, and disseminate information regarding 1. State and local laws, regulations, and policies affecting the development, maintenance, improvement, availability, or cost of affordable housing, including tax policies affecting land and other property, land use controls, zoning ordinances, building codes, fees and charges, growth limits, and policies that affect the return on investment in residential property, and the prevalence and effects on affordable housing of such laws, regulations, and policies. State and local activities, strategies, and plans to remove or ameliorate the negative effects of any of such laws, regulations, and policies, including particularly innovative or successful activities, strategies, and plans. And 3. State and local strategies, activities, and plans that promote affordable housing and housing desegregation, including particularly innovative or successful strategies, activities, and plans. And then B, the functions of the clearinghouse established under subsection A shall 1. Respond to inquiries from state and local governments, other organizations, and individuals requesting information regarding state and local laws, regulations, policies, activities, strategies, and plans described in subsection A. 2. Provide assistance in identifying, examining, and understanding such laws, regulations, policies, activities, strategies, and plans. And 3. By making available through a worldwide website of the department, by electronic mail, or otherwise providing to each housing agency of a unit of general local government that serves an area having a population greater than 1,000, an index of all state and local strategies, plans submitted under subsection A to the clearinghouse, which A shall describe the types of barriers to affordable housing that the strategy or plan was designed to ameliorate or remove, and B shall not later than 30 days after submission to the clearinghouse of any new strategy or plan be updated to include the new strategy or plan submitted. C. Organization. The clearinghouse under this section shall be established within the Office of Policy Development of HUD and shall be under the direction of the Assistant Secretary for Policy Development and Research. D. Timing. The clearinghouse under this section, as amended by Section 103 of the Housing Affordability Barrier Removal Act 2000, shall be established and commence carrying out the functions of the clearinghouse under this section not later than 1 year after December 27, 2000. The Secretary of HUD may comply with the requirements under this section by reestablishing the clearinghouse that was originally established to comply with this section and updating and improving such clearinghouse to the extent necessary to comply with the requirements of this section as in effect pursuant to the enactment of such act. Okay, so all of that they want to repeal. They want to abolish. I don't want to just say suspicious, but I am very apprehensive. That's a better word. I am very apprehensive when they decide to repeal anything because of our current authoritarian regime that is calling the shots right now. That puts me on edge with everything they want to abolish. But that's what we have here in reference to 1. All right. 2, repeal. Section 1205 of the Housing and Community Development Act of 1992 is repealed. Okay, the wording of this. It's very important, right? We got to pay attention to the wording of these pieces of legislation because they matter more than anything. So in general, the regulatory barriers clearinghouse established pursuant to this act of 1992 is abolished, and then they want to repeal Section 1205 of the HUD Act of 1992. So they want to repeal it too. So not only do they want to abolish the regulatory barriers clearinghouse itself, they're making a point to say we want to abolish the specific purpose of this, but we also want to repeal this whole act. Okay? I don't like that. I don't fucking like that because everything they described here in this act is to no, I want to say streamline, but provide a place where information is accessible to different departments. And because the information is accessible and because the information there's a part of its transparency, right? That these city municipalities are able to read that information, be informed, hold people accountable if needed, right? Because they have the information at their fingertips. What you're telling me is you don't want that. That's what you're saying here. That has to be one of the most important pieces I've seen I've seen already, and we're not even like a quarter way through this yet. You can tell me if you think, oh, you're being a little too paranoid about it. I don't think I am. I think what that is, but hey, if anything, but hey, I'm very open-minded with this kind of stuff. I know I can learn just as much as you guys are learning. All right, D, reporting. No later than 5 years after the date on which the Assistant Secretary publishes the final guidelines and best practices for state and local zoning frameworks under this section, the Assistant Secretary shall submit to the Congress a report describing... Yeah, see, they want to do their own reporting through the Assistant Secretary, but you're not... I don't like the fact that you're... I don't like this, yeah. They're like trying to say, oh, but we're still going to be posting guidelines and best practices, but we're not going to be as transparent with all the details and information for you. I don't like that. That's what that part that like really is suspicious to me. Okay, let's go over this again. D, reporting. Not later than 5 years after the date on which the Assistant Secretary publishes the final guidelines and best practices for state and local zoning frameworks under this section, the Assistant Secretary shall submit to the Congress a report describing 1. The states that have adopted recommendations from the guidelines and best practices pursuant to Section 4 of this Act. 2. A summary of the localities that have adopted recommendations from the guidelines and best practices pursuant to Section 4 of this Act. Wait, so you're putting more reporting into the hands of federal government. I feel like that's a very consistent thing we've been seeing on a lot of these pieces, but I don't know. Maybe I'm misunderstanding this, but I don't... 3. We'll keep reading. 3. A list of states that adopted a state zoning framework. 4. A summary of the modifications that each state has made in their state zoning framework. 5. A general summary of the types of updates localities have made to their local zoning framework. 6. With respect to the states that have adopted a state zoning framework or recommendations from the guidelines and best practices, the effect of such adoptions. And 7. A summary of any recommendations that were routinely not adopted by states or by localities. I don't like the fact that it's like a rundown of all this information, or like a report on the states to the federal government, but yet information within the cities you're abolishing. Yeah, I don't like that. I don't like less transparency. I don't like anything that indicates less transparency between federal and state levels. That bothers me. I think right now, well, obviously, it's not surprising that would be the case. But I think in terms of that's why we need to push back when we see that, because there needs to be as much transparency as we can hold on to between local, state, and federal governments. Because the way we've been going now, it's too easy for people to get away with things and not be held accountable, and for people to not be informed, and then to find little loopholes to not inform you of what's going on behind the scenes. There's just too much of that. E, rule of construction. Nothing in this section may be construed to permit the Department of HUD to permit HUD to take on adverse action against or fail to provide otherwise offered actions or services for any state or locality if the state or locality declines to adopt a guideline or best practice under subsection C. Well, there's at least that. Section 102, Accelerating Home Building Grant Program. A, in general, the Secretary may establish a pilot program to award grants to eligible entities to review designs of covered structures of mixed income housing and designate such reviewed designs to be included in pattern books for use in the jurisdiction of the eligible entity. B, restriction. Amounts awarded under this section may not be used for construction, alteration, or repair work. That's a big thing, actually. When it comes to grant money, a big thing is the fact that they only let it be used for the program itself and not any kind of construction, alteration, or repair work. And they usually have like a certain amount of like a percentage of the grant money that you're allowed to use for administrative purposes. And those administrative purposes vary, but they do have references to what they include in those documents, or in the contracts. But that amounts awarded, that's actually, it's very or the restriction, that's a very common restriction. Just for clarification or context purposes, that's pretty much across the board. C, considerations. In reviewing applications submitted by eligible entities for a grant under this section, the Secretary shall consider 1. The need for affordable housing in the eligible entity. 2. The presence of high opportunity areas in the eligible entity. 3. Coordination between the eligible entity and a state agency. And 4. Coordination between the eligible entity and state, local, and regional transportation planning authorities. How about there just be like a base? of connection or coordination between them, right? I don't know. That's just initial thoughts. D, set aside for rural areas. Of the amounts made available in each fiscal year for grants under this section, the Secretary shall ensure that not less than 10% shall be used for grants to eligible entities that are located in rural areas, okay? E, report requirement. Not later than 3 years after being awarded a grant under this section, an eligible entity shall submit to the Secretary a report that, 1, describes the impacts of the activities carried out using the amounts provided under this section on improving the protection and supply of affordable housing. 2, include a list of any pattern books the eligible entity has established using amounts provided under this section, including a description of the designs such pattern book includes. 3, identifies the number of permits issued by the eligible entity for housing development using designs from such pattern book. And 4, identifies the number of housing units produced in developments of the eligible entity using a design from such pattern book. F, availability of information. The Secretary shall, 1, to the extent possible, encourage eligible entities awarded grants under this section to make any pattern books established by such entity and designs in such pattern book publicly available through a website. And 2, collect, identify, and disseminate best practices relating to pattern books and make such information publicly available on a website of the Department of HUD. G, repayment of awarded amounts. The Secretary may require an eligible entity to return to the Secretary grant amounts awarded under this section if the Secretary determines that the eligible entity has not approved a sufficient number of building permits that use designs included in a pattern book established by the eligible entity during the 5-year period following receipt of the grant by the eligible entity, unless such period is extended by the Secretary. H, sunset. The pilot program established under this section shall terminate on the date that is 7 years after the date of the enactment of this section. I, definitions. In this section, 1, affordable housing. The term affordable housing means housing for which the total monthly housing cost payment is not more than 30% of the monthly household income for a household earning not more than 80% of the area median income. 2, coverage structure. The term coverage structure means a low-rise or mid-rise structure with not more than 25 dwelling units that may include A, an accessory dwelling unit, B, infill development, C, a duplex, D, a triplex, E, a fourplex, F, a cottage court, G, a courtyard building, H, a townhome, I, a multiplex, and J, any other structure with not less than 2 dwelling units that the Secretary has determined in advance to be appropriate. Eligible entity. The term eligible entity means A, a unit of general local government as defined in Section 102A of the Housing and Community Development Act of 1974, in other words, 42 U.S. Code 5302A. A unit of general local government in that reference means any city, county, town, township, parish, village, or other general purpose political subdivision of a state, Guam, the Northern Mariana Islands, the Virgin Islands, and American Samoa, or a general purpose political subdivision thereof, a combination of such political subdivisions that, except as provided in Section 5306D 4 of this title, is recognized by the Secretary and the District of Columbia. Such term also includes a state or local public body or agency, as defined in Section 4512 of this title, community association or other entity, which is approved by the Secretary for the purpose of providing public facilities or services to a new community as part of a program meeting the eligibility standards of Section 4513 of this title or Section 4 of the Housing and Urban Development Act of 1968. In other words, 42 USC Code, United States Code 3901. B, an Indian tribe as defined in Section 102A of the Housing and Community Development Act of 1974. The term Indian tribe means any Indian tribe, band, group, and nation, including Alaska, Indians, Aleuts, and Eskimos, and any Alaskan native village of the United States, which is considered an eligible recipient under the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act. In other words, 25 United States Code 5301, or was considered an eligible recipient under Chapter 67 of Title 31 prior to the repeal of such chapter. High Opportunity Area. The term High Opportunity Area has the meaning given the term in Section 1281.1 of Title 12, Code of Federal Regulations, or any successor regulation. Okay. High opportunity area for purposes of subpart C of this part means, and this is coming from the definition now, I, an area designated by HUD as a difficult development area pursuant to 26 U.S. Code 42 D5B3 during any year covered by an undeserved markets plan or in the year prior to an undeserved markets plan effective date, whose poverty rate is lower than the rate specified by FHFA in the evaluation guidance. Guys, sorry, sometimes I kind of laugh to myself because, like, I know legal jargon has a place, but sometimes I feel like they just make this stuff as dense as possible when it's not, like, necessarily needed. I just feel like this stuff can be, like, so much more user-friendly, you know? Anyways, 2. An area designed by a state or local qualified allocation plan as a high opportunity area in which meets a definition FHFA has identified as eligible for duty to serve credit in the evaluation guidance. Okay, so that's what high opportunity area means in this context. Infill development, and now we're on definition 5 of this little section. The term infill development means a residential housing development or small parcels in previously established areas for replacement by new or refurbished housing that utilizes existing utilities and infrastructure. 6. Mixed income housing. The term mixed income housing means a housing development that is comprised of housing units that promote differing levels of affordability in the community. Okay. Pattern book. The term pattern book means a set of pre-reviewed designated designs or construction plans that are assessed and approved as by right development by localities for compliance with local building and permitting standards to streamline and expedite approval pathways for housing constructions. Okay. 8. Rural area. The term rural area means any area other than a city or town that has a population of less than 50,000 inhabitants. If I ever thought there was any doubt that I was technically from a rural area, guys, that's yes. According to the definition, I grew up in a rural area. My hometown was, what, 1,200 people? That's insane. 50,000 is insane to think that you have to... That seems like a lot. But that's just because from, like, my perspective, right? 1,200 versus 50,000. That's going to be a lot from this end of the field. All right. 9. Secretary. The term secretary means the secretary of HUD. All right. Remember, we have 7 sections of this area. So, of this part. So we are definitely not going to have, like, this video is not going to contain more than section 1 or piece 1 of this act. All right. I'm hoping some of the other stuff is going to be a little bit more streamlined, but based off of how many references and how much, like, content was in it, this may be like a 7 video fucking part. Oh my God. Okay. Anyways, so just thoughts, right? Section 103, federal guidelines for point access block buildings. Okay. A, in general, not later than 18 months after the date of enactment of this section, the Secretary of HUD shall issue guidelines to provide states, territories, tribes, and localities with model code language, best practices, and technical guidance that could be used to facilitate the permitting of point access block residential buildings. Okay. B, contents. When developing the guidelines under subsection A, the Secretary shall consider 1. Fire safety considerations, including sprinkler coverage, smoke detection, ventilation, and building egress performance. 2. Construction costs and potential impacts on housing affordability, including the potential for increasing housing supply in high-cost jurisdictions. 3. Flexibility for diverse consumer needs, including family sizes, unit configurations, and accessibility. 4. Examples of single stair codes adopted or considered by states and cities in the United States. 5. Examples. Single stair codes used in relevant international standards. 6. Research and model language relating to single stair codes produced by organizations that focus on point access, block building design, and building code reform. 7. Consulting with experts, including developers, architects, fire marshals, researchers, economists, housing authorities, and officials in states that have enacted or piloted single stair codes. And 8. Alternative methods of safety compliance, including options that utilize additional passive or active safety features. C. Coordination with the International Code Council. The Secretary shall coordinate with the International Code Council to encourage the International Code Council to incorporate provisions about point access block buildings into the International Building Code. D. Grants. 1. In general, the Secretary may establish a program to award competitive grants to eligible entities to implement pilot projects that evaluate, demonstrate, or validate the safety, feasibility, or cost effectiveness of point access block residential buildings. 2. Sunset. The program established under paragraph 1 shall terminate on the date that is 7 years after the date of the enactment of this subsection. E. Rules of construction. Nothing in this section may be construed to preempt a state or local building code. And then F. Definitions in this section. You only have 2. 1. Eligible entity. The term eligible entity means a state, unit of local government, tribal government, public housing agency, nonprofit housing organization, community development organization, private developer, construction firm, qualified design firm, engineering firm, academic institution, research institution, or any partnership or consortium comprised of 2 or more such types of entities. 2. Point access block building. The term point access block building means a group R2 occupancy residential structure. As such term is defined by the International Building Code, in which a single internal stairway provides access and egress for all dwelling units in a building that is not greater than 6 stories in height. Section 104. Unlocking housing supply through streamlined and modernized reviews. A. NEPA. Streamlining for HUD housing-related activities. 1. In general, the Secretary of HUD shall, in accordance with the Section 553 of Title V United States Code, expand and reclassify housing-related activities under the necessary administration regulations as follows. Section 553 of Title V United States Code is referencing 553 rulemaking. This section applies according to the provisions thereof, except to the extent that there is involved 1. A military or foreign affairs function of the U.S., or 2. A matter relating to agency management or personnel or to public property, loans, grants, benefits, or contracts. B. General notice of proposed rule making shall be published in the Federal Register unless persons subjected thereto are named and either personally served or otherwise have actual notice thereof in accordance with the law. The notice shall include 1. A statement of the time, place, and nature of public rule-making proceedings. 2. Reference to the legal authority under which the rule is proposed. 3. Either the terms or substance of the proposed rule or a description of the subjects and issues involved. And 4. The internet address of a summary of not more than 100 words in length of the proposed rule in plain language that shall be posted on the internet website under Section 206D of the E-Government Act of 2002. In other words, 44 U.S.C. United States Code 3501 No, commonly known as regulations.gov. Except when notice or hearing is required by statute, this subsection does not apply. A. To interpretive rules, general statements of policy or rules of agency, organization, procedure, or practice, or when the agency for good cause finds and incorporates the finding and a brief statement of reasons therefore in the rules issued, that notice and public procedure thereon are impracticable, unnecessary, or contrary to the public interest. C. After the notice required by this section, the agency shall give interested persons an opportunity to participate in the rule making through submission of written data, views, or arguments with or without opportunity for oral presentation. After consideration of the relevant matter presented, the agent shall incorporate in the rules adopted a concise general statement of their basis and purpose. When rules are required by statute to be made on the record after opportunity for an agency hearing, Sections 556 and 557 of this title apply instead of the subsection. D. The required publication or service of a substantive rule shall be made not less than 30 days before its effective date, except 1. A substantive rule which grants or recognizes an exemption or relieves a restriction. 2. Interpretive rules and statements of policy, or 3. As otherwise provided by the agency for good cause and published with a rule. E. Each agency shall give an interested person the right to petition for the issuance, amendment, or repeal of a rule. A. The following housing-related activities shall be subject to regulations equivalent or substantially similar to the regulations entitled Exempt Activities, as set forth in Section 58.34 of Title 24, Code of Federal Regulations, as in effect on January 1st, 2025. Exempt activities in 58.34 that it's referencing contains this. A. Except for the applicable requirements of 58.6, the responsible entity does not have to comply with the requirements of this part or undertake any environmental review, consultation, or other action under NEPA and the other provisions of law or authorities cited in 58.5 for the activities exempt by this section or projects consisted solely of the following exempt activities. 1. Environmental and other studies, resource identification and the development of plans and strategies. 2. Information and financial services. 3. Administrative and management activities. 4. Public services that will not have a physical impact or result in any physical changes, including but not limited to services concerned with employment, crime prevention, childcare, health, drug abuse, education, counseling, energy conservation, and welfare or recreational needs. 5. Inspections and testing of properties for hazards or defects. 6. Purchase of insurance. 7. Purchase of tools. 8. Engineering or design costs. 9. Technical assistance and training. 10. Assistance for temporary or permanent improvements that do not alter environmental conditions and are limited to protection, repair, or restoration activities necessary only to control or arrest the effects from disasters or imminent threats to public safety, including those resulting from physical deterioration. 11. Payment of principal and interest on loans made or obligations guaranteed by HUD. 12. Any of the categorical exclusions listed in 58.35a, provided that there are no circumstances which require compliance with any other federal laws and authorities cited in 58.5. B. A recipient does not have to submit an RROF and certification, and no further approval from HUD or the state will be needed by the recipient for the drawdown of funds to carry out exempt activities and projects. However, the responsible entity must document in writing its determination that each activity or project is exempt and meets the conditions specified for such exemption under this section. I. Tenant-based rental assistance as defined in Section 8.0 of the United States Housing Act of 1937. In other words, 42 United States Code 1437 FO. Okay. In 42 USC 1437 FO, tenant-based rental assistance, the Secretary may provide assistance to public housing agencies for tenant-based assistance using a payment standard established in accordance with subparagraph B. The payment standard will be used to determine the monthly assistance that may be paid for any family as provided in paragraph 2. Okay? So the amount of monthly assistance payment is subject to the requirement under section 1437AA3 of this title relating to minimum rental amount. The monthly assistance payment for a family receiving assistance under this subsection shall be determined as follows. A. Tenant-based assistance, rent not exceeding payment standard. For a family receiving tenant-based assistance, if the rent for the family, including the amount allowed for tenant-paid utilities, does not exceed the applicable payment standard established under paragraph 1, the monthly assistance payment for the family shall be equal to the amount by which the rent, including the amount allowed for tenant-based utilities, exceeds the greatest of the following amounts, rounded to the nearest dollar. 1. 30% of the monthly adjusted income of the family. 2. 10% of the monthly income of the family. 3. If the family is receiving payments for welfare assistance from a public agency and a part of those payments, adjusted in accordance with the actual housing cost of the family, is specifically designated by that agency to meet the housing cost of the family, the portion of those payments that is so designated. For a family receiving tenant-based assistance, if the rent for the family, including the amount allowed for tenant-based utilities, exceeds the applicable payment standard established under paragraph 1, the monthly assistance payment for the family shall be equal to the amount by which the applicable payment standard exceeds the greatest of amounts under clauses 1, 2, and 3 of subparagraph A. 2. Supportive services, including healthcare, housing services, permanent housing placement, daycare, nutritional services, short-term payment for rent, mortgage or utility cost, and assistance in gaining access to federal government and state and local government benefits and services. 3. Operating costs, including maintenance, security, operation, utilities, furnishings, equipment, supplies, staff training, and recruitment, and other incidental costs. Economic development activities, including equipment purchases, inventory financing, interest subsidies, operating expenses, and similar costs not associated with construction or expansion of existing operations. Activities to assist home buyers to purchase existing dwelling units or dwelling units under construction, including closing costs and down payment assistance, interest rate buy-downs, and similar activities that result in the transfer of title. 6. Affordable housing pre-development costs related to obtaining site options, project financing, administrative costs, and fees for loan commitment, zoning approvals, and other related activities that do not have a physical impact. 7. Approval of supplemental assistance, including insurance or guarantee to a project previously approved by the Secretary. 8. Emergency homeowner or renter assistance for HVAC, hot water heaters, and other necessary uses of existing utilities required under applicable law. B. The following housing-related activities shall be subject to regulations equivalent or substantially similar to the regulations entitled 1. Categorical exclusions not subject to Section 58.5. 58.5 is referencing the related federal laws and authorities. In accordance with the provisions of law cited in 58.1b, the responsible entity must assume responsibilities for environmental review, decision-making, and action that would apply to HUD under the following specified laws and authorities. The responsible entity must certify that it has complied with the requirements that would apply to HUD under these laws and authorities, and must consider the criteria, standards, policies, and regulations of these laws and authorities. And it references several types, such as historic properties. It needs to be in compliance with the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966, specifically Sections 106 and 110. Executive Order 11593, Protection and Enhancement of the Cultural Environment. Federal Historic Preservation Regulations as follows. 36 CFR Part 800 with respect to HUD programs other than Urban Development Action Grants, and 36 CFR Part 801 with respect to UDAG. The Reservoir Salvage Act of 1960 as amended by the Archaeological and Historic Preservation Act of 1974. And in regard to floodplain management and wetland protection, they would have to comply with Executive Order 11988, Floodplain Management as amended by Executive Order 13690, as well as Executive Order 11990, Protection of Wetlands. C. And then in regard to coastal zone management, they would have to comply with the Coastal Zone Management Act of 1972. And then when it comes to HUD environmental standards, applicable criteria and standards specified in Part 51 of this title, other than the runway clear zone notification requirement in 51.303A3. Also, it is HUD policy that all properties that are being proposed for use in HUD programs be free of hazardous materials, contamination, toxic chemicals and gases, and radioactive substances, where a hazard could affect the health and safety of occupants or conflict with the intended utilization of the property. The environmental review of multifamily housing with 5 or more dwelling units, including leasing or non-residential property, must include the evaluation of previous uses of the site or other evidence of contamination on or near the site to ensure that the occupants of proposed sites are not adversely affected by any of the hazards listed in this section. Particular attention should be given to any proposed site on or in the general proximity of such areas as dumps, landfills, industrial sites, or other locations that contain or may have contained hazardous waste. The responsible entity shall use current techniques by qualified professionals to undertake investigations determined necessary. And then in terms of environmental justice, you have to comply with Executive Order 12898, Federal Actions to Address Environmental Justice in Minority Populations and Low-Income Populations. Next. 2. Categorical exclusions not subject to the federal laws and authorities cited in Sections 50.4 and Section 58.35b and Section 15.19, respectively, of Title 24, Code of Federal Regulations, as in effect on January 1st, 2025, if such activities do not materially alter environmental conditions and do not materially exceed the original scope of the project. So Section 1504 references related federal laws and authorities. HUD and or applicants must comply, where applicable, with all environmental requirements, guidelines, and statutory obligations under the following authorities and HUD's standards. A. Historic properties. The National Historic Preservation Act of 1966 as amended, also referred to as 16 United States Code 470. Executive Order 11593, Protection and Enhancement of the Cultural Environment. The Archaeological and Historic Preservation Act of 1974, which amends the Reservoir Salvage Act of 1960. Procedures for the protection of historic and cultural properties. In terms of flood insurance, floodplain management, and wetland protection, 1. Flood Disaster Protection Act of 1973 and the National Flood Insurance Reform Act of 1994. 2. HUD procedure for the implementation of Executive Order 11988, Floodplain Management, as amended by Executive Order 13690. 3. HUD procedure for the implementations of Executive Order 11990, Protection of Wetlands. In terms of coastal areas protection and management, we have the Coastal Barrier Resources Act as amended by the Coastal Barrier Improvement Act of 1990, the Coastal Zone Management Act of 1972 as amended. In terms of sole source aquifers, they have to abide by the Safe Drinking Water Act of 1974. In terms of endangered species, and guys, as I'm going through this, ones are popping out at me already that are bills or acts that they're already trying to change or abolish. So that's another thing to keep a lookout for. It all connects. Interestingly enough, if you're paying attention, you can start to see patterns of what they're doing. Endangered species, the Endangered Species Act of 1973 as amended. In terms of wild and scenic rivers, the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act as amended. And in terms of water quality, the Federal Water Pollution Control Act as amended by the Federal Water Pollution Control Act amendments of 1972 and later enactment. In terms of water quality, the Federal Water Pollution Control Act as amended by the Federal Water Pollution Control Act amendments of 1972 and later enactments. Air quality, the Clean Air Act as amended. Solid waste management, the Solid Waste Disposal Act as amended by the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act of 1976 and later enactments, as well as the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act of 1980 as amended. In terms of farmlands protection, the Farmland Protection Policy Act of 1981 as amended. In terms of HUD environmental standards, applicable criteria and standards specified in the HUD environmental regulations, which is also 24 CFR Part 51. And then environmental justice, Executive Order 12898, federal actions to address environmental justice in minority populations and low-income populations. And then section 50.19, categorical exclusions not subject to the federal laws and authorities cited in 50.4. Okay? General, the activities and related approvals of policy documents listed in paragraphs B and C of this section are not subject to the individual compliance requirements of the federal laws and authorities cited in 50.4, unless otherwise indicated below. These activities and approvals of policy documents are also categorically excluded from the EA requirement by NEPA, except in extraordinary circumstances. HUD approval or implementation of these categories of activities and policy documents does not require environmental review because they do not alter physical conditions in a manner or to an extent that would require review under NEPA or the other laws and authorities cited at 50.4. And then B, the activities. 1. Environmental and other studies, resource identification, and the development of plans and strategies. 2. Information and financially advisory services. 3. Administrative and management expenses. 4. Public services that will not have a physical impact or result in any physical changes, including but not limited to services concerned with employment, crime prevention, childcare, health, drug abuse, education, counseling, energy conservation, and welfare or recreational needs. 5. Inspections and testing of properties for hazards or defects. 6. Purchase of insurance. 7. Purchase of tools. 8. Engineering or design costs. 9. Technical assistance and training. 10. Assistance for temporary or permanent improvements that do not alter environmental conditions that are limited to protection, repair, or restoration activities necessary only to control or arrest the effects from disasters or imminent threats to public safety, including those resulting from physical deterioration. 11. Tenant-based rental assistance. 12. Supportive services including but not limited to healthcare, housing services, permanent housing placement, daycare, nutritional services, short-term payments for rent, mortgage, utility costs, and assistance in gaining access to local, state, and federal government benefits and services. Operating costs including maintenance, security, operation, utilities, furnishings, equipment, supplies, staff training and recruitment, and other incidental costs. However, in the case of equipment, compliance with 50.4b1 is required. 14. Economic development activities including but not limited to equipment purchase, inventory financing, interest subsidy, operating expenses, and similar costs not associated with construction or physical expansion of existing facilities. However, in the case of equipment purchase, compliance with 50.4b1 is also required. 15. Activities to assist home buyers to purchase existing dwelling units or dwelling units under construction, including closing cost and down payment assistance, interest buy-downs, and similar activities that result in the transfer of title. Housing pre-development costs, including legal, consulting, development, and other developer and other costs related to site options, project financing, admin costs, and fees for loan commitments, zoning approvals, and other related activities which do not have a physical impact. HUD's insurance of 1 to 4 family mortgages under the Direct Endorsement Program, the insurance of 1 to 4 family mortgages under the Lender Insurance Program, and HUD's guarantee of loans for 1 to 4 family dwellings under the Direct Guarantee Procedure for the Indian Housing Loan Guarantee Program without any HUD review or approval before the completion of construction or rehabilitation and the loan closing, and HUD's acceptance for insurance of loans insured under Title I of the National Housing Act. However, compliance with 50.4B1 and C1 and 24 CFR 51.303A3 is required. 18. HUD's endorsement for 1 to 4 family mortgage insurance for proposed construction under improved area processing. However, the review appraiser check sheet, Form HUD 54891, must be completed. Activities of the Government National Mortgage Association under Title III of the National Housing Act, 12 USC Code 1716. And then 20, activities under the Interstate Land Sales Full Disclosure, also referred to as 15 United States Code 1701. 21, refinancing of HUD-insured mortgages that will not allow new construction or rehabilitation nor result in any physical impacts or changes except for routine maintenance. However, compliance with, again, 50.4B1 is required. 22, approval of the sale of a HUD-held mortgage. 23, approval of the foreclosure sale of a property with the HUD-held mortgage. However, appropriate restrictions will be imposed to protect historic properties. 24, HUD guarantees under the Loan Guarantee Recovery Program, 24 CFR Part 573, of loans that refinance existing loans and mortgages where any new construction or rehabilitation financed by the existing loan or mortgage has been completed prior to the filing of an application under the program, and the refinancing will not allow further construction or rehabilitation nor result in any physical impacts or changes except for routine maintenance. However, compliance with 50.4B1 and C1 and 51.303A is required. And then C, approval of policy documents. 1. Approval of rules and notices proposed for publication in the Federal Register or other policy documents that do not direct, provide for assistance or loan and mortgage insurance for, or otherwise govern or regulate real property acquisition, disposition, leasing, other than tenant-based rental assistance, rehabilitation, alteration, demolition, or new construction, or establish, revise, or provide for standards for construction or construction materials, manufactured housing, or occupancy. 2. Approval of policy documents that amend an existing document where the existing document as a whole would not fall within an exclusion in this paragraph C, but the amendment by itself would do so. 3. Approval of policy documents that set out fair housing or non-discrimination standards or enforcement procedures, or provide for assistance in promoting or enforcing fair housing or non-discrimination. 4. Approval of handbooks, notices, and other documents that provide operating instructions and procedures in connection with activities under a Federal Register document that has previously been subject to required environmental review. 5. Approval of a Notice of Funding Availability, NOFA, that provides funding under and does not alter any environmental requirements of a regulation or program guideline that was previously published in the Federal Register, provided that the NOFA specifically refers to the environmental review provisions of the regulation or guideline, and the regulation or guideline contains no environmental review provisions because it concerns only activities listed in paragraph B of the section. 6. Statutorily required and or discretionary establishment and review of interest rates, loan limits, building cost limits, prototype costs, fair market rent schedules, HUD-determined prevailing wage rates, income limits and exclusions with regard to eligibility for or calculation of HUD housing assistance or rental assistance, and similar rate and cost determinations and related external administrative or fiscal requirements, or procedures which do not constitute a development decision that affects the physical condition of specific project areas or building sites. 1. Acquisition, repair, improvement, reconstruction, or rehabilitation of public facilities and improvements other than buildings if the facilities and improvements are in place and will be retained in the same use without change in size or capacity of more than 20%, including replacement of water or sewer lines, reconstruction of curbs and sidewalks, and repaving of streets. 2. Rehabilitation of 1 to 4 unit residential buildings and existing housing related infrastructure such as repairs or rehabilitation of existing wells, septics, or utility lines that connect to that housing. 3. New construction, development, demolition, acquisition, or disposition on up to 4 scattered site existing dwelling units where there is a maximum of 4 units on any one site. 4. Acquisitions including leasing or disposition of or equity loans on an existing structure or acquisition including leasing of vacant land if the structure or land is acquired, financed, or disposed of will be retained for the same use. C. The following housing-related activities shall be subject to regulations equivalent or substantially similar to the regulations entitled 1. Categorical exclusions subject to Section 58.5, and 2. Categorical exclusions subject to the federal laws and authorities cited in Sections 50.4 and Section 58.35a and Section 50.20, respectively, of Title 24 Code of Federal Regulations as in effect on January 1st, 2025. If such activities do not materially alter environmental conditions and do not materially exceed the original scope of the project. Okay, so this is repeating from 50.4, but in terms of 58.35a, categorical exclusions, categorical exclusion refers to a category of activities for which no environmental impact statement or environmental assessment and finding of no significant impact under NEPA is required, except in extraordinary circumstances. See 58.2a3, in which a normally excluded activity may have a significant impact. Compliance with the other applicable federal environmental laws and authorities listed in 58.5 is required for any categorical exclusion listed in paragraph A of this section. Paragraph A. Categorical exclusions subject to 58.5. The following activities are categorically excluded under NEPA but may be subject to review under authorities listed in 58.5. 1. Acquisition, repair, improvement, reconstruction, or rehabilitation of public facilities and improvements other than buildings, when the facilities and improvements are in place and will be retained in the same use without change in size or capacity of more than 20%, e.g., replacement of water, sewer lines, reconstruction of curbs and sidewalks, or repaving of streets. 2. Special projects directed to the removal of material and architectural barriers that restrict the mobility and accessibility to elderly and handicapped persons. 3. Rehabilitation of buildings and improvements when the following conditions are met. 1. In the case of a building for residential use with 1 to 4 units, the density is not increased beyond 4 units and the land use is not changed. 2. In the case of multifamily residential buildings, unit density is not changed more than 20%, as well as the project does not involve changes in land use from residential to non-residential, and the estimated cost of rehabilitation is less than 75% of the total estimated cost of replacement after rehabilitation. 3. In the case of non-residential structures, including commercial, industrial, and public buildings, the facilities and improvements are in place and will not be changed in size or capacity by more than 20%. And the activity does not involve a change in land use, such as from non-residential to residential, commercial to industrial, or from one industrial use to another. 4. An individual action on up to 4 dwelling units where there is a maximum of 4 units on any one site. The units can be 4 one-unit buildings or 1 4-unit building, or any combination in between. An individual action on a project of 5 or more housing units developed on scattered sites when the sites are more than 2,000 feet apart and there are not more than 4 housing units on any one site. Paragraphs A41 and 2 of this section do not apply to rehabilitation of a building for residential use with 1 to 4 units. 5. Acquisition, including leasing or disposition of or equity loans on an existing structure, or acquisition, including leasing of vacant land, provided that the structure or land acquired, financed, or disposed of will be retained for the same use. And 6. Combinations of the above activity. And lastly, in this little paragraph, section 50.20 references categorical exclusions subject to the federal laws and authorities cited in 50.4. A. The following actions, activities, and programs are categorically excluded from the NEPA requirements for further review in an environmental assessment or an environmental impact statement as set forth in this part. They are not excluded from individual compliance requirements of other environmental statutes, executive orders, and HUD standards cited in 50.4 where appropriate. Where the responsible official determines that any proposed action identified below may have an environmental effect because of extraordinary circumstances, the requirements for further review under NEPA shall apply. 1. Special projects directed to the removal of material and architectural barriers that restrict the mobility of and accessibility to elderly and persons with disabilities. 2. Rehabilitation of buildings and improvements when the following conditions are met. In the case of a building for residential use with 1 to 4 units, the density is not increased beyond 4 units and the land use is not changed. In the case of multifamily residential buildings, unit density is not changed more than 20%. The project does not involve changes in land used from residential to non-residential, and the estimated cost of rehabilitation is less than 75% of the total estimated cost of replacement after rehabilitation. In the case of non-residential, and some of this does sound a little familiar because little bits of it are repetitive in the references. In the case of non-residential structures, including commercial, industrial, and public buildings, the facilities and improvements are in place and will not be changed in size or capacity by more than 20%, and the activity does not involve a change in land use, such as from non-residential to residential, commercial to industrial, or from one industrial use to another. 3. An individual action on up to 4 dwelling units where there is a maximum of 4 units on any one site. The units can be 4 one-unit buildings or 1 4-unit building on any combination in between, or an individual action on a project of 5 or more housing units developed on scattered sites when the sites are more than 2,000 feet apart and there are not more than 4 housing units on any one site. Paragraphs A3(1) and 2 of this section do not apply to rehabilitation of a building for residential use with 1 to 4 units. 4. Acquisition including leasing or disposition of or equity loans on an existing structure, or acquisition including leasing of vacant land provided that the structure or land acquired, financed, or disposed of will be retained for the same use. 5. Purchased or refinanced housing, and medical facilities under Section 223F of the National Housing Act, also referred to as 12 U.S.C. Code 1715N. 6. Mortgage repayments or plans of action, including incentives under 24 CFR Part 248. B. For categorical exclusions having the potential for significant impact because of extraordinary circumstances, HUD must prepare an EA in accordance with Subpart E. If it is evident without preparing an EA that an EIS is required pursuant to 50.42, HUD should proceed directly to the preparation of an EIS in accordance with Subpart F. 1. Acquisitions of open space or residential property where such property will be retained for the same use or will be converted to open space to help residents relocate out of an area designed as a high-risk area by the Secretary. Conversion of existing office buildings into residential development subject to A. A maximum number of units to be determined by the Secretary, and B. A limitation on the change in building size to not more than 20%. 3. New construction, development, demolition, acquisition, or disposition on 5 to 15 dwelling units where there is a maximum of 15 units on any one site. The units can be 15 one-unit buildings or 1 15-unit building, or any combination in between. New construction, development, demolition, acquisition, or disposition on 15 or more housing units developed on scattered sites when there are not more than 15 housing units on any one site, and the sites are more than a set number of feet apart as determined by the Secretary. Rehabilitation of buildings and improvements in the case of a building for residential use with 5 to 15 units if the density is not increased beyond 15 units and the land use is not changed. 6. Infill projects consisting of new construction, rehabilitation, or development of residential housing units. 7. Buyouts, defined as a voluntary acquisition of properties located in a floodway, a floodplain, or an other area clearly delineated by the grantee that has been impacted by a predictable environmental threat to the safety and well-being of program beneficiaries caused or exacerbated by a federally declared disaster. 2. Report. The Secretary shall submit to the Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs of the Senate and the Committee on Financial Services of the House of Representatives annual reports during the 5-year period beginning on the date that is 2 years after the date of enactment of this Act that provide a summary of findings of reductions in review times and administrative cost reduction with a particular focus on the affordable housing sector as a result of the actions set forth in this subsection, and any recommendations of the Secretary for future congressional action with respect to revising categorical exclusions or exemptions under Title 24 Code of Federal Regulations. B. Better use of intergovernmental and local development for housing. Designation of environmental review procedure. The Department of Housing and Urban Development Act 42 United States Code 3531 is amended by inserting after Section 12, 42 U.S.C. Code 3537A, the following. Okay, so 3531 they want to amend references Congressional Declaration of Purpose. The Congress hereby declares that the general welfare and security of the nation and the health and living standards of our people require, as a matter of national purpose, sound development of the nation's communities and metropolitan areas in which the vast majority of its people live and work. To carry out such purpose, and in recognition of the increasing importance of housing and urban development in our national life, the Congress finds that establishment of an executive department is desirable to achieve the best administration of the principal programs of the federal government, which provide assistance for housing and for the development of the nation's communities, to assist the President in achieving maximum coordination of the various federal activities which have a major effect upon urban community, suburban or metropolitan development, to encourage the solution of problems of housing, urban development, and mass transportation through state, county, town, village, or other local and private action, including promotion of interstate, regional, and metropolitan cooperation, to encourage the maximum contributions that may be made by vigorous private home building and mortgage lending industries to housing, urban development, and the national economy, and to provide for full and appropriate consideration at the national level of the needs and interests of the nation's communities and of the people who live and work in them. 42 U.S.C. Code 3537A references prohibition of advanced disclosure of funding decisions. A. Prohibited actions. During any selection process, no officer or employee of the Department of HUD shall knowingly disclose any covered selection information regarding such selection directly or indirectly to any person other than a person authorized by the Secretary to receive such information. B. Admin remedies. If the Secretary receives or obtains information providing a reasonable basis to believe that a violation of subsection A has occurred, the Secretary shall, 1. In the case of a selection that has not been made, determine whether to terminate the selection process or take other appropriate actions, and 2. In the case of a selection that has been made, determine whether to A. Void or rescind the selection, subject to review and determination on the record after opportunity for a hearing. B. Impose sanctions upon the violating applicant selected, subject to review and determination on the record after opportunity for a hearing. C. Permit the violating applicant selected to continue to participate in the program, or D. Take any other actions that the Secretary considers appropriate. C. Civil money penalties. In general, whenever any employee of the department knowingly and materially violates the prohibition in subsection A, the Secretary may impose a civil money penalty on the employee in accordance with the provisions of this subsection. This penalty shall be in addition to any other available civil remedy or any available criminal penalty and may be imposed whether or not the Secretary takes other disciplinary actions. 2. Amount. The amount of the penalty, as determined by the Secretary, may not exceed $10,000 for each violation. Agency procedures. A. Establishment. The Secretary shall establish standards and procedures governing the imposition of civil money penalties under this subsection. These standards and procedures shall provide for the Secretary or other official of the department to make the determination to impose a penalty or to use an admin entity to make the determination, and shall provide for the imposition of a penalty only after the employee has been given an opportunity for a hearing on the record, and lastly, may provide the review of any determination or order, interlocutory ruling arising from a hearing. B. Final orders. If no hearing is requested within 15 days of receipt of the notice of opportunity for hearing, the imposition of the penalty shall constitute a final and unappealable order. If the Secretary reviews a determination or order, the Secretary may affirm, modify, or reverse that determination or order. If the Secretary does not review the determination or order within 90 days of the issuance of the determination or order, the determination or order shall be final. Factors in determining the amount of penalty. In determining the amount of a penalty under paragraph 2, consideration shall be given to such factors as the gravity of the offense, any history of prior disclosures of information on pending funding decisions made after December 15, 1989, ability to pay the penalty, injury to the public, benefits received, deterrence of future violations, and such other factors as the Secretary may determine in regulations to be appropriate. Reviewability of imposition of a penalty. The Secretary's determination or order imposing a penalty under paragraph 1 shall not be subject to review except as provided in paragraph 4. Paragraph 4. Judicial review of agency determination. A. In general, after exhausting all admin remedies established by the Secretary under paragraph 3A, an employee against whom the Secretary has imposed a civil money penalty under paragraph 1 may obtain a review of the penalty in such ancillary issues such as any admin sanctions under 24 CFR Part 25, as may be addressed in the Notice of Determination to impose a penalty under paragraph 3AI in the appropriate Court of Appeals of the U.S. by filing in such court within 20 days after the entity of such order or determination a written petition praying the Secretary's order or determination be modified or be set aside in whole or in part. Objections not raised in hearing. The court shall not consider any objection that was not raised in the hearing conducted pursuant to paragraph 3A unless a demonstration is made of extraordinary circumstances causing the failure to raise the objection. If any party demonstrates the satisfaction of the court that additional evidence not presented at such hearing is material and there were reasonable grounds for the failure to present such evidence at the hearing, the court shall remand the matter to the secretary for consideration of such additional evidence. Scope of review. The decisions, findings, and determinations of the secretary shall be reviewed pursuant to section 706 of Title V. Order to pay penalty. Notwithstanding any provision of law in any such review, the court shall have the power to order payment of the penalty imposed by the secretary. Action to collect penalty. If any employee fails to comply with the secretary's determination or order imposing a civil money penalty under paragraph 1, after the determination or order is no longer subject to review as provided by paragraphs 3A and 4, the secretary may request the Attorney General of the United States to bring an action in an appropriate United States District Court to obtain a monetary judgment against the employee and such other relief as may be available. The monetary judgment may, in the court's discretion, include the attorney's fees and other expenses incurred by the United States in connection with the action. In an action under this subsection, the validity and appropriateness of the secretary's determination or order imposing the penalty shall not be subject to review. 6. Settlement by secretary. The secretary may compromise, modify, or remit any civil money penalty which may be or has been imposed under this subsection. 7. Deposit of penalties. The secretary shall deposit all civil money penalties collected under this subsection into miscellaneous receipts of the Treasury. D. Criminal penalties. Whoever willfully violates subsection A by making a disclosure prohibited by subsection A to any applicant or any officer, employee, representative, agent, or consultant of any applicant shall be imprisoned not more than 5 years or fined in accordance with Title 18 or both. So the Department of Housing and Urban Development Act that they want to amend, they want to keep all of what I just read of section 12 and insert section 13, designation of environmental review procedure. A, in general, as provided in subsection B, the secretary may, for purposes of environmental review, decision-making, and action pursuant to the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969, also referred to as 42 United States Code 4321, and other provisions of law that further the purposes of such act, designate the treatment of assistance administered by the secretary as funds for a special project for purposes of section 305C of the Multifamily Housing Property Disposition Reform Act of 1994, also called 42 United States Code 3547. So the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969 is basically the Congressional Declaration of Purpose. The purpose of this chapter are to declare a national policy which will encourage productive and enjoyable harmony between man and his environment, to promote efforts which will prevent or eliminate damage to the environment and biosphere, and stimulate the health and welfare of a man, to enrich the understanding of the ecological systems and natural resources important to the nation, and to establish a council on environmental quality. Whenever you're listening to all this, it's also important to think about the context of what the goals seem to be of the federal government right now and how that could possibly affect the changes that they're wanting to be made by passing these pieces of legislation. Guys, I really would just prefer if this federal government we didn't pass anything while they were in office, because all of this in that context just sounds terrible. And it's just, a lot of it is giving the federal government more autonomy, more control. In terms of this, the Housing of the 21st Century Act, it's more control in terms of housing. And we're not even halfway through this yet, and that's what I'm getting. And I don't like anything that is trying to clearly take away, or try to clearly build more power for the federal government to control things programs that we rely on, right? Anything that takes away from state power, to me right now, is a really bad thing, is a really like red alert, So again, this last sentence, and other provisions of law that further the purposes of such act designate the treatment of assistance administered by the secretary as funds for a special project for purposes of section 305C of the Multifamily Housing Property Disposition Reform Act of 1994. So 42 U.S. Code 3547 special projects is, in general, the release of funds in order to assure that the policies of the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969 and other provisions of law which further the purposes of such act as specified in regulations issued by the Secretary are most effectively implemented in connection with the expenditure of funds for special projects appropriated under an Appropriations Act for the Department of HUD, such as special projects under the head Annual Contributions for Assisted Living in Title II of the Departments of Veteran Affairs and Housing and Urban Development and Independent Agencies Appropriation Act, 1993, and to assure to the public undiminished protection of the environment. The Secretary of HUD may, under such regulations, in lieu of the environmental protection procedures otherwise applicable, provide for the release of funds for particular special projects upon the request of receipts of special projects assistance. If the state or unit of general local government, as designated by the Secretary in accordance with regulations, assumes all of the responsibilities for environmental review, decision-making, and action pursuant to such act and such other provision of law as the regulations of the Secretary specify, that would otherwise apply to the Secretary were the Secretary to undertake such special projects as federal projects. And of course that can go a lot deeper, but like I said, we're deep diving, not going down a rabbit hole. Okay, so that's part A of what they want to add, right? Part B, exception. The designation described in subsection A shall not apply to assistance for which a procedure for carrying out the responsibilities of the Secretary under the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969 and other provisions of law that further the purposes of such act is otherwise specified in law. Tribal assumption of environmental review obligations. Section 305C of the Multifamily Housing Property Disposition Reform Act of 1994 is amended by striking state or unit of general local government each place it appears and inserting state, Indian tribe, or unit of general local government. If the state or unit of general local government, as designated by the Secretary in accordance with regulations, assumes all of the responsibilities for environmental review, decision-making, and action pursuant to such act and such other provision of law as the regulations of the Secretary specify, that would otherwise apply to the Secretary were the Secretary to undertake such special projects as federal projects. So the whole if the state or unit of general local government would be replaced with if the state, Indian tribe, or unit of general local government. My question to you guys is why you think they would do that? Why you think they would highlight Indian tribes in this? Like, what's the purpose? Because if we go into the next one, B, in paragraph 1C, in the heading, by striking state or unit of general local government and inserting state, Indian tribe, or unit of general local government, it would look like this. So C is responsibilities of state or unit of general local government. The Secretary's duty under subparagraph B shall not be construed to limit any responsibility assumed by a state or unit of general local government with respect to any particular release of funds under subparagraph A. So this would be the responsibilities of state, Indian tribe, or unit of general local government. And then C, by adding at the end the following. 5. Definition of Indian tribe. For purposes of this subsection, the term Indian tribe means a federally recognized tribe, as defined in Section 413B of the Native American Housing Assistance and Self-Determination Act of 1996. In other words, 25 United States Code 410313B. And under 13B, the term federally recognized tribe means any Indian tribe, band, nation, or other organized group or community of Indians, including any Alaska Native village or regional or village corporation as defined in or established pursuant to the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, that is recognized as eligible for the special programs and services provided by the United States to Indians because of their status as Indians, pursuant to the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act. Applicability. Any activity generated under subsections A and B or would be subject to an authorization of appropriations. D. Infill project defined. In this section, the term infill project means a project that occurs within the geographical limits of a municipality, is adequately served by existing utilities and public services as required under applicable law, is located on a site of previously disturbed land of not more than 5 acres and substantially surrounded by residential or commercial development, will repurpose a vacant or underutilized parcel of land or dilapidated or abandoned structure, and will serve a residential or commercial purpose. Section 105, Federal Housing Agency Application of Environmental Reviews. A. Memorandum of Understanding. In general, not later than 180 days after the date of enactment of this act, the Secretary of HUD and the Secretary of Agriculture shall enter into a memorandum of understanding to A, evaluate the use of categorical exclusions as defined in Section 111 of the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969, in other words, 42 U.S.C. 4336E, for housing projects funded by amounts from the Department of HUD and the Department of Agriculture. So 42 U.S.C. 4336E references definitions. The term categorical exclusion means a category of actions that a federal agency has determined normally does not significantly affect the quality of the human environment within the meaning of Section 4332 2C of this title. And then the cooperating agency. The term cooperating agency means any federal, state, tribal, or local agency that has been designated as a cooperating agency under this section. Under Section 4336A3 of this title. B, develop a process to designate a lead agency among the Department of HUD and the Department of Agriculture to streamline the adoption of environmental impact statements and environmental assessments approved by the other agency to construct housing projects funded by amounts from both agencies. Maintain compliance with environmental regulations under Part 58 of Title 24 Code of Federal Regulations as in effect on January 1st, 2025. And D, evaluate the feasibility of a joint physical inspection process for housing projects funded by amounts from the Department of HUD and the Department of Agriculture. 2, report. Not later than 1 year after the date of enactment of this act, the Secretary of HUD and the Secretary of Agriculture shall submit to the Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs of the Senate and the Committee on Financial Services of the House of Representatives a report that includes recommendations for legislative, regulatory, or administrative actions. A, to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of housing projects funded by amounts from the Department of HUD and the Department of Agriculture. And B, that do not materially with respect to residents of housing projects described in subparagraph A, reduce the safety of those residents, shift long-term costs onto those residents, or undermine the environmental standards for those residents. B, study and review. I think the question here too, as we're getting into it, is also, even if some of this stuff does sound like they're like, okay, they're gonna have a little bit more power into how housing works, or in terms of housing, right, the federal government in this context, but then they're making sure that they say, oh, but you're still gonna have these protections and the actions aren't gonna affect your quality of life, right? But here's the thing, we have a federal government that's not being held accountable, so giving them more power and then expecting them to uphold the rules in these documents doesn't seem like it's working, right? So I don't know, that's also something to think about. Hence me saying earlier, I don't like any bill that gives them more power right now, but you guys can let me know what you think. All right, so B, study and review. 1, exemption. In providing assistance under Section 501, 502, 504, 515, 533, or 538 of the Housing Act of 1948, in other words, 42 U.S.C. Code 1471, 1472, 1474, 1485, 1490M, or 1490P2, for the construction or modification of residential housing located on an infill site, the Secretary of Agriculture shall not be required to carry out any study or report on the environmental effects of such assistance. So 42 U.S.C. Code 1471 references financial assistance by Secretary of Agriculture. So the authorization and purposes of assistance. The Secretary of Agriculture, hereinafter referred to as the Secretary, is authorized, subject to the terms and conditions of the subchapter, to extend financial assistance through the Farmers Home Administration. 1. To owners of farms in the United States and in the territories of Alaska and Hawaii and the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, the territories and possessions of the U.S., and the Trust Territory of the Pacific Islands, to enable them to construct, improve, alter, repair, or replace dwellings and other farm buildings on their farms, and to purchase buildings and land constituting a minimum adequate site in order to provide them, their tenants, lessees, sharecroppers, and laborers with decent, safe, and sanitary living conditions and adequate farm buildings as specified in this subchapter. And 2, to owners or other real estate in rural areas for the construction, improvement, alteration, or repair of dwellings, related facilities, and farm buildings, and to rural residents, including persons who reside in reservations or villages of Indian tribes, for such purposes and for the purchase of buildings and the purchase of land constituting a minimum adequate site in order to enable them to provide dwellings and related facilities for their own use and buildings adequate for their farming operations. And then 3, to elderly or handicapped persons or families who are or will be the owners of land in rural areas for the construction, improvement, alteration, or repair of dwellings and related facilities. The purpose of dwellings and related facilities and the purchase of land constituting a minimum adequate site in order to provide them with adequate dwellings and related facilities for their own use. And 4, to an owner described in clause 1, 2, or 3 for refinancing indebtedness which was incurred for an eligible purpose described in such clause, and if not refinanced, is likely to result because of circumstances beyond the control of the applicant at an early date in the loss of the applicant's necessary dwelling or essential farm service buildings, or if combined, in the case of a dwelling that the Secretary finds not to be decent, safe, and sanitary, with the loan for improvement, rehabilitation, or repairs and not refinanced, is likely to result in the applicants continuing to be deprived of a safe, decent, and sanitary dwelling. 42 U.S.C. Code 1472 references loans for housing and buildings on adequate farms. Okay? And then 1474 then goes on to reference loans and grants for repairs or improvements of rural dwelling. And then 42 U.S.C. Code 1485 references housing and related facilities for elderly persons and families or other persons and families of low income. 42 U.S.C. Code 1490M then goes to references housing preservation grants. And then 1490P2, loan guarantees for multifamily rental housing in rural areas. So it's basically saying in providing assistance under those sections through those programs for the construction or modification of residential housing located on an infill site, the Secretary of Agriculture shall not be required to carry out any study or report on the environmental effects of those assistance. And then report not later than the date that is 5 years after the date of this section. The Secretary of Agriculture shall submit to the Committee on Financial Services of the House of Representatives and the Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs of the Senate a report that A, determines whether the implementation of this section reduce the amount of time it takes to review an application for assistance under the sections of the Housing Act of 1949 identified in paragraph 1, and reduce the admin cost of providing such assistance. And then B, describes how the implementation of this section affects the affordable housing sector in rural America. And C, includes any legislative recommendations from the Secretary of Agriculture. Any legislative recommendations. Okay. Definitions. In this section, A, greenfield. The term greenfield means a site that has not been developed, including a woodland, farmland, and an open field. Infill site. The term infill site means a site that is served by existing infrastructure, including water lines, sewer lines, and roads. And does not include a site that is served by existing infrastructure that only consists of roads. A site within a census tract designated as a very high or relatively high risk for wildlife, coastal flooding, and riverine flooding under the National Risk Index of the Federal Emergency Management Agency pursuant to Section 206 of the Robert T. Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act. In other words, 42 U.S.C. 5136, and a greenfield. Okay, so going back here, in providing assistance under these sections for the construction or modification of residential housing located on those infill sites, shall not be required to carry, So any site that is served by existing infrastructure, including water lines, sewer lines, and roads, and you guys are like, I'm going to be pointing right here as I'm like, so you can follow along of what I'm looking at, because this is like, I'm connecting this together, and this is really, why would that be an exemption? And I don't like that. It's interesting. It like stands out. Okay. It stands out that this means a site that is served by existing infrastructure, including water lines, sewer lines, and roads. So basically this is what I'm looking at, okay? I'm looking at all those loans that were given for housing for the construction or modification of residential housing located on sites that include water lines, sewer lines, and roads. That the Secretary of Agriculture shall not be required to carry out any study or report on the environmental effects. So they're exempt from reporting any studies or reports on the environmental effects on these areas that are on water lines, sewer lines, and roads. That sounds weird. That sounds odd. Okay, like in terms of why would you want that exemption? Like what are you hiding? But like, what are you? I don't know, guys. That brings up a lot of questions. That's the thing, is that's the point, right? Going through this, it prompts questions. And if it's going to prompt questions, you want to demand those answers, because if you don't get those answers, you don't know what they're doing. And I think that's really weird. It makes you think. It makes you think. And that's the point of this video. And this is why I want you guys along for the ride. Section 106, Multifamily Loan Limits. In general, Title 2 of the National Housing Act, in other words, 12 United States Code 1707, is amended. So 12 United States Code 1707 contains the definitions of the legal definitions of mortgage, mortgagee, maturity date, state, family member, child, estate. They are amending that by the following. In Section 206A, in other words, 12 U.S.C. 1712A, which is the indexing of FHA multifamily housing loan limits. So it's the dollar amount set forth in this title. A, in subsection A, in the matter following paragraph 7, by striking commencing in 2004 and all that follows through the period at the end and inserting the following. Commencing on January 1, 2026, the adjustment of the dollar amounts shall be calculated by the Secretary using the percentage change in the price deflator index of multifamily residential units under construction released by the Bureau of the Census from March of the previous year to March of the year in which the adjustment is made, or calculated by the Secretary using an alternative indicator after publishing information about such alternative indicator in the Federal Register for the public comment if the price deflator index of multifamily residential units under construction is not available or published. So everything that follows that commencing in 2004 that it wants to strike and all that follows through the period at the end is this. Commencing in 2004 on the effective date of the Federal Reserve Board's adjustment of the 400 figure in the Home Ownership and Equity Protection Act of 1994, also called HOPA, the adjustment of the dollar amounts shall be calculated using the percentage change in the Consumer Price Index for all urban consumers, CPIU, as applied by the Federal Reserve Board for purposes of the above described HOPA adjustment. So that they want to replace with using the price deflator index of multifamily residential units. That is going to be released year to year. And then B, by striking subsection B. Subsection B is this. Notification. The Federal Reserve Board, on a timely basis, shall notify the Secretary on his designee in writing of the adjustment described in subsection A and of the effective date of such adjustment in order to permit the Secretary to undertake publication in the Federal Register of corresponding adjustments to the dollar amounts. The dollar amount of any adjustment shall be rounded to the next lower dollar. So they want to replace that with rounding. The dollar amount of any adjustment described in subsection A shall be rounded to the next lower dollar. C, publication. The Secretary shall publish in the Federal Register any adjustments made to the dollar amount. In Section 207C3A, in other words, 12 United States Code 1713C3A, they are making a bunch of monetary changes. Okay, so we're going to go through this. All right. In A, they're raising it from $38,025 to $167,310. This section is called eligibility for insurance, mortgage limits. Okay, that's what they're going to be changing here. 3A states not to exceed for such part of the property or project as may be attributable to dwelling use, excluding exterior land improvements as defined by the Secretary, $38,025 per family unit without a bedroom. So they're actually going to be raising that to say $167,310 per family unit without a bedroom. $42,120 per family unit with one bedroom is going to be changed to $185,328 per family unit with one bedroom. And then we have $50,310 per family unit with two bedrooms to be changed to $221,364 per family unit with two bedrooms. So this is all loan limits that they're increasing, or mortgage loan limits. And then $62,010 per family unit with three bedrooms is going to be changed to $272,844 per family unit with three bedrooms, and $70,200 per family with unit with four or more bedrooms is going to be changed to $308,880 per family unit with four or more bedrooms. And then the or not to exceed $17,460 per space is going to be adjusted to, oh, no, they're not adjusting that. They're just striking that out. Okay, we're just striking out or not to exceed $17,460 per space. Okay. So because affordability is so high, it does cause me to question, okay, so we're raising loan limits so people can actually afford those homes, right? But what does that do in terms of interest? That's going to be the, I think that's really going to determine whether this change is going to be long-term good or a good long-term or bad long-term. But we'll see. Okay, and then it states, except that as to projects to consist of elevator type structures, the secretary may in his discretion increase the dollar amount limitations per family unit to not to exceed $43,875 per family unit without a bedroom. That's going to be adjusted to $193,050 per family unit without a bedroom. And then it says $49,140 per family unit with one bedroom. That's going to raise to $216,216 per family unit with one bedroom. And then for two bedrooms, it's going from $60,255 to $265,122. And then, of course, the family unit with three bedrooms is going from $75,465 to $332,046. And then lastly, for 4 or more bedrooms, it's going from $85,328 to $375,443. And again, that's for mortgage limits. Okay. And then in section 213B2, in other words, 12 United States Code 1750EB2, they're making similar changes. Okay. So this references eligibility conditions for projects under subsection A1 of this section. 2A states not to exceed for such part of the property or project as may be attributable to dwelling use, excluding exterior land improvements as defined by the secretary. So we're going from $41,207 per family unit without a bedroom to $181,311 per family unit without a bedroom. And then we're going from the family unit with one bedroom, it is jumping from $47,511 to $209,048. I mean, they're bumping it up. That's like tripling it. And then we're going for per family unit with two bedrooms from $57,300 to $252,120. And then per family unit with three bedrooms, it's going from $73,343 to $322,709. And then per family unit with 4 or more bedrooms, it's going from $81,708 to $359,515. And then just like the previous one did, it does emphasize projects that consist of elevator type structures that would increase the dollar amount limitations not to exceed $43,879 per family unit without a bedroom originally, and that's going to get bumped up to $193,050 per family unit without a bedroom. And then of course per family unit with one bedroom, we go from $49,710 to $218,724. Those are just like massively insane jumps. I don't know I'm stating the obvious, but that's just like yeah. And then for a family unit with two bedrooms, we're going from $60,446 to $265,962. And then per family unit with three bedrooms, $78,197 to $344,067. And then of course with 4 or more bedrooms, we're going from $85,836 to $377,678. In section 220D3B31, in other words, 12 United States Code 1715 KD3B31. Yeah, I know that is a mouthful of a reference. Okay, and these next two references have similar jumps, right? It's the same type of pattern. Okay, For this one, the increase in mortgage limits, you have less than one bedroom, 2 bedroom, 3 bedroom, 4 more bedrooms. And then with an elevator type structure, you got less than one bedroom, 2 bedroom, 3 bedroom, and 4 more bedrooms. And it makes the same huge jump in the mortgage limits, right? We're going from 38,025 to 167,310, and so on and so on. And then in section 221D421, in other words, 12 United States Code 17151D421, this references the mortgage limits if executed by a mortgager and which is approved by the secretary. And it shows the same type of increase. You got 37,843 jumping to 166,509. And it's the same type of pattern. You have less than one bedroom, 2 bedroom, 3 bedroom, 4 bedrooms or more. You have, if there is an elevator type structure, again, less than one bedroom, 2 bedroom, 3 bedroom, 4 bedroom or more. And then of course with 4 bedroom or more, you're going to have 80,913 mortgage limit jumping to $356,017. And I know I generally read word from word, but I think in terms of this one, seeing the pattern is going to be more important than trying to remember the numbers. Okay. And plus you can see the numbers right here on the screen. So 6 in section 231 C2A, in other words, 12 United States Code 1715 VC2A. This references eligibility for insurance, maximum amount of mortgage, terms and conditions. To be eligible for insurance under this section, a mortgage to provide housing for elderly persons, right? Okay, so even here, you're going to see the same type of pattern. You're going to see less than one bedroom, 2 bedroom, 3, 4 or more with elevator type structure. Less than one bedroom, 2 bedroom, 3 bedroom, 4 or more. And then you have again $80,913 jumping to $356,017. I can't get over those massive increases. Okay, 7 in section 234E3A, also referred to as 12 United States Code 1715Y E3A. This references the eligibility for insurance of blanket mortgages of multifamily projects. And we're seeing the jump from less than one bedroom, $42,048 and jumping to $185,011. And again, with an elevator-like structure with 4 more bedrooms, you're going to have $87,588 jumping to $385,387. I mean, at least it's consistent. B, rule of construction. Nothing in this section or the amendments made by this section may be construed to limit the authority of the Secretary of HUD to revise the statutory exemptions for a high cost percentage and high cost areas annual indexing. Section 107, GAO study on workforce housing. In general, not later than 1 year after the date of the enactment of this section, the Comptroller General of the United States shall conduct a study and submit to the Congress a report that 1. Identifies obstacles middle-income households face when looking to secure affordable housing. 2. Identifies geographic areas where housing is the most unaffordable and unavailable for middle-income households. 3. Includes a list of federal housing programs, including federal tax credits, grants, and loan programs that are not available to middle-income households due to their income status, including federal housing programs designed to promote affordability. 4. Recommends income and other parameters to establish a clear and consistent federal definition for the term workforce housing for use when describing the segment of housing that could be made available to such middle-income households in federal housing programs if funding commensurate with the additional eligibility were to be made available. And 5. Analyzes how to modify or newly develop new federal housing programs and incentives to include workforce housing if funding commensurate with the additional eligibility were to be made available. And then B, middle income household defined. In this section, the term middle income household means a household with an income above 80%, but that it does not exceed 120% of the median family income of the area as determined by the Secretary, with adjustments for smaller and larger families. All right, guys, that is all of that. I'm going to be straight with you guys. We're recorded in multiple videos, and all of that is Title I, Building Smarter for the 21st Century. I don't think I'm a fan of any kind of exemptions to any kind of environmental reviews. I'm just going to say that. That's the biggest thing I'm going to get from this one. Or the biggest, thing that I'm going to remember from this section. But then we're going to have Title II in the next video. modernizing local development and rural housing programs. Well, we can see how they're going to want to modernize that. That'll be interesting. But anyways, guys, I hope you enjoy. Do like the video if you like it. Do share it. Do let me know if you want to see a certain kind of like, you want to see the video shorter, if you want me to, like I said in the beginning of the video, if it's digestible as smaller units, feel free to tell me. But anyways, guys, again, thanks for watching. I hope this provides some kind of clarity into what they're working on in terms of housing for the 21st century. I'll see y'all in the next video.